Welcome back to Actually Useful, the show where we diagnose what's wrong with the internet and chat with the good folks trying to fix it. Today we have an amazing guest with us, Kelly Stonelake, and we have some news that's pretty fitting for today's guest. Ariel, do you want to kick us off here?
Sure. We literally could not have timed this better, y'all. Kelly is a Meta whistleblower advocating for children's safety on social media platforms. And this week was a terrible week for Meta and a great week for us and people trying to see social media regulation. So I'll give the highlights, but I'm sure, Kelly, you have a lot more information. So yesterday, LA County Superior Court wrapped up its jury trial featuring KGM, a 20-year-old whose childhood was oversaturated with addictive social media. It really damaged her psyche, caused a lot of body dysmorphia, depression, anxiety, and Meta was found responsible. Meta and Google, so YouTube was also in the suit. They're now paying her $6 million, which is obviously chump change, but it's a great precedent. And then the day before, the state of New Mexico found Meta liable for endangering children. This was a response of, I think, a 2023 undercover sting using Facebook to try to see child groomers get fed to the fake child on there. Meta was found negligent. They violated state unfair practices law, and they're being fined $375 million as a result. So Kelly, you were very involved in the evidence that supported these trials. You have been a huge advocate since you left Meta. Before we get into your background, just what's your reaction to these trials? A lot of the people who've been testifying. You've testified yourself on a number of congressional hearings and different trials. So what do you take this to be, and what do you think it means for the future of Meta and these many trials? So there's more trials, there's thousands more trials scheduled.
Yeah, it is a huge moment. I was brought to tears when I heard the verdict yesterday. I think regardless of the verdict, this represents to me the beginning of the end, where evidence that tells the story of what I experienced firsthand that we'll talk about later, but this gap between public statements and internal company practices, where that evidence becomes something that the public gets to see. And I think that that alone is a huge win, that there are legal teams that have found approaches to hold companies accountable that aren't about the content itself, which is protected and shielded by Section 230, but is about how products are designed and what executives know, and then the impact that has on vulnerable people. And I think that it's really cool that it is, in both cases, juries of 12 of our peers who get to look at that gap between the public statements and the private kind of internal practices, because all of the efforts to try to drive reform and, legislation, it is up against Meta's tens of millions of dollars of lobbying funds, right? It's up against data centers being put into home states of people who are in a place to kind of influence those decisions. Whereas the 12 people in that juror box, their responsibility was to the truth. And it just says a lot, and it's just a huge moment for people like me who've experienced it, but especially for the parents who have led this movement for years and years and years to get a moment of acknowledgement and validation.
Yeah, I saw a video of the parents getting the information outside the trial and them just reacting, and it was so emotional. And so, it's, you know this firsthand, but it is very taxing to try to go up against these companies and to be the people. We had talked about this the last time you and I chatted, but the Meta team wore smart glasses to the trial, and that was probably to dox the jury. These people are scary, this is big money. And so to be just a regular person, this is a perfect example of how can you find agency against big tech. And this is sort of the biggest example of you got to do this shit in the end. This is where it goes in the end, is that we've got to be able to actually hold them accountable. And so it's great that we did. And people are comparing it to the 1998 big tobacco settlements, where a similar thing happened that like a whole bunch of 46 different states were suing the four big tobacco companies. And as a result, they settled for a huge amount of money, like many, many billions of dollars. And then that ended up paving the way for cigarettes being taxed more and being so prohibitively expensive, for there being a crackdown on where people can smoke. And I was like looking this up a little bit. I didn't realize this, but those lawsuits were all driven by truth.org. If you guys remember the like orange background of the Truth commercials, where they like any of the videos of like people on the ventilators that was like really harrowing when we were kids, or like the body bags being pulled out, that was all truth.org. And they were, I mean, kind of annoying commercials, but they were extremely instrumental in getting this type of settlement done. So I do think that we're seeing a similar reckoning by like all these trials happening at the same time, and it really just pummeling. I mean, Zuck is basically professionally defending himself at this moment. That's the roadmap.
You know that phrase that's like Europe regulates and America litigates? Well, I feel like that was like really important here, because we actually talked about this in our intensity episode. But if you look at like tobacco or environmental regulation, I mean, even like big sugar or pharma, like trying to distract people or saying the science is controversial, or saying there's not, you know, plurality of experts who agree that there's a direct link between, you know, smoking and cancer, or in this case, like media usage and addiction and suicide and certain outcomes. And so having that first court case that sets the precedent that no, we can draw a straight line here, I think is going to be incredibly important going forward.
And I wish that we had better regulation and we're not just independently litigating all these things. But like, I the first time I was like watching this, it felt similar to the recent trial of the parents being held accountable for a son shooting people. And it's like that was like a leap, like a legal leap that we were not. It felt crazy and bold and big, and they won. Like that, the parents were held responsible. And so it's like, yeah, we gotta, especially when we're talking about kids being harmed and perpetuating harm, like that is the same cycle, right? That like kids become harmful when they are getting harmed, right? And so we want to keep them out of these ecosystems. So, but before we get into all that, Kelly, please give us a little bit of your background, how you got into this, how you became a Meta whistleblower, and how you became such an advocate for kids on the internet.
Sure. Yeah. So, you know, I, like y'all, care a lot about and have always been really passionate about technology. And I started working at Meta. I had previously been at Apple. I mean, it was in 2009. So really long time ago, when the company was in, you know, employees numbered in the hundreds, and Mark Zuckerberg sat across the floor from me. And it was the dream job, right? Like I felt like we were changing the world. It just didn't turn out exactly how I expected. But it was a really great place to be for a very long time. We were solving some really complex problems. It felt like we were really putting our customer first and creating a lot of value. Y'all talk a lot about enshittification, and so it definitely follows that path. And you know, after the IPO and kind of as more kind of external attention came down on the company, there was definitely a long phase in the middle where I was, I think, discounting a lot of the external criticism as fundamental kind of misunderstanding. Like, how could it be that a company or individuals would do things that would knowingly cause harm, right? And I think a lot of folks have been in that place for a while. It's why these lawsuits are so important. But in 2022, you know, after spending almost, you know, a decade working on kind of an internal creative agency, working with advertisers, spending a lot of time working with third-party data practices, I was asked to come in and step in and lead the go-to-market function, product marketing for Horizon Worlds. It's both kind of informing product development as well as figuring out, okay, how do we actually take a product to the consumer? And I was so excited about it because this was the first time in my 13, 14 years there that I was working on a consumer-facing product. And that excitement was short-lived, though, because as soon as I kind of got on the job, it was an ultimate record scratch in my kind of paradigm of how what the company stood for that I was a part of and had helped to build, because I joined a leadership team it was otherwise all men, and I was immediately kind of read in on the open secret that there were a huge amount of children using Horizon Worlds, it's the kind of flagship virtual reality software that existed in the Oculus headset. Now it's on mobile and tablet, and more and more so will probably only exist there. But the issue with the fact that there were so many kids there is that kids technically weren't allowed in the product, which meant that they were accessing it using adult accounts, which meant that they had kind of unfettered access to speak openly with unknown adults. We're talking about kids definitely under the age of 13. Many of them sounded under 5 years old. And we were building this product in the likeness of Roblox, which, I learned pretty quickly after joining Horizon was a proven breeding ground for predators. And all of this is, of course, happening where, there's very little federal legislation to protect kids. But COPPA is meant to ensure that technology companies can't collect data on children without parental consent. And so by using these adult accounts, we also have a huge amount of data being collected on kids without parental consent, including photos of their faces and their homes. And, it was just a wild situation. And the concern of the peer group I joined was how to protect Meta from risk. It was, let's make sure there's, no record of our knowledge of this, and let's make sure that we make it seem like we are really invested in safety. And when I kind of raised that issue, I became the issue. So that was the beginning of that journey.
What were some of the examples of like the most egregious discrepancies between what Meta was saying about Horizon Worlds to the consumers versus what you knew was going on the inside? I will also just point out, if you're comfortable with us linking it, I'd love to link your documentation in our episode description, because one of the big takeaways I've been following your story now for like over a year. I've seen your documentation. You have amazing records for what you knew. And I think this is also a really good example of like whistleblower documentation. So yeah. I encourage anybody who's got stuff going on in their own company to take a look at it of like, this is the type of documentation that you would want to be doing. So I thank you for all that work. But yeah, what were some of the most like egregious sort of sins committed where you were like, oh my God, what are we doing here?
Yeah, well, before I actually got on the job, when I was having conversations with other leaders within the organization about why this was such a cool opportunity, I was told this story about, imagine the gay kid in Kansas who has no community that understands him, and he can put on this headset and be in Horizon and be surrounded by other kids who are like him and find that sense of belonging and community. And as someone who cares deeply about that kid in Kansas having community and every kid like him, I was so excited about that. But the actual experience for people in Horizon was rampant. Bullying and harassment based on all sorts of protected classes. Things like, we knew that it took 34 seconds on average for someone in a Black or brown avatar to be called the N-word or a racial slur. We knew that there was flagrant kind of sexual harassment, groping, all sorts of experiences that are super unsafe. And we knew that people were being kind of ridiculed, teased. It was not a safe space for anyone, especially someone who is marginalized. And, there were concerns that had been raised by others in the organization when I got there, like, A, there's product quality issues, but B, there are so many kids here. Very few people are staying in Horizon. They come, it's a really bad experience, and they leave. Like, this marketing campaign that I'm supposed to run is not going to be successful. And when I went to the room of my peers and said, hey, we need to talk about these issues that Carrie is surfacing, Jeff Lynn, who's the product design director, he said, yeah, Kelly, we need to talk about these issues and we need you to shut her up. And, we're going to find out if you're as good as they say you are. So it was this kind of insular boys club, like loyalty to company over everything sort of mentality, which was really disturbing. And then the other thing that's coming to mind is, when I got in there, we were set to, the job I was asked to do was to effectively lead these 3 launches. One was officially to kids and teens as young as 10. One was to expand to international markets. And the third was to expand to mobile and tablets to be kind of more competitive with Roblox and broadly across the board to reach more people, more kids. But the launch date, which was initially slated for end of December 2022 for these expansions, our parental controls weren't going to be ready. And the solution, the plan of record, was that we were going to launch a comprehensive parental education campaign that really implied that parental controls existed, and then they would be a, quote, fast follow to kids being allowed into the product. So they were planning fully, even knowing, all these issues that we were having, just to kind of let kids in without any way for parents to kind of manage that experience and keep them safe. But we're going to make sure that parents felt that it would be safe.
Well, it makes total sense that a board of men who are downplaying the complaints filed by women and, with a high rate of churn, who are literally asking you to shut up another woman instead of investigating her complaint, would create a product that is unsafe to women and marginalized groups and fosters that same culture of, oppression. Did you feel at any point like they were concerned at all about these issues, or was it more of we're concerned because this would expose us to litigation?
The primary concern was really about protecting the company. And I think that there was this kind of like cult-like, kind of delusional, like holier than thou sort of justification mentality around, if we can't grow this product fast enough to be competitive with, say, Roblox, like we're never going to have an opportunity to, see what it can be. And it was almost like any cost justified that means. Like, of course, I think that the leaders of the company would prefer it not be an environment that was harmful, primarily because that is also a PR risk, but it was not the priority. I mean, once my peers and I put on our Oculus headsets and went into Horizon to play test the product, and we couldn't even hear each other over the sounds of screaming kids. And, that was before they were supposed to be there. That meant that they were all there using adult accounts, and the solution was just to move to a private world so that we could continue testing the product.
Yeah, that story, that's happened multiple times because Laura Bates also covers that in her book. And obviously her book covers a lot about Horizon Worlds and Roblox, and she's been covering it. You have it in some of your documentation. I'm so curious. One of the things that we have talked a lot about, specifically with like AI, is when it comes up for us the most, is like, there's a thing in, product development where because you're twiddling and you're iterating and you're changing the product to make the people who are using it use it more and get their friends to use it and create this, flywheel or whatever. With AI, I think a thing we're seeing a lot with chatbots is like, even if you didn't intend to make your special AI companion a sex companion, because people are using it that way, like that is the features that you're going to highlight. Like Laura Bates talks about, like nudify apps don't even work on male bodies because there is simply no demand to make men be nudified in these apps. And I'm curious, like when I hear and look at your documentation saying like Horizon Worlds wanted to directly compete with Roblox, like in your read, like it's one thing to say we're developing a product for this group of users for these use cases. It's supposed to have this experience. And also as a result, we have this byproduct, like secondary symptom of kids are on it and they shouldn't be on it. And so then there's a question of like, are you going to solve that secondary problem to keep protecting your primary use case? Where we see these huge problems is that like the use case you say you support is not actually what you are optimizing for, because it's not actually your secondary problem is actually your primary use case and is where people are using it. And so like it kind of sounds like you're saying that that is the case for Horizon Worlds, that they were like, we want it to be kids. We're making more features to get kids on this app. Is that kind of your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the kind of concerts that were being booked in and the games that were being developed, I mean, was really geared toward a younger audience. And, I was asked, hey, let's expand this officially to kids. I think that they thought that might cover their butts around the fact that there had already been so many kids in the product. But, listening to what you just said, I'm thinking a lot about Cory Doctorow and shittification, because it's like, that is just not how you would build a business if you didn't have hundreds of millions of dollars, well, $70 billion as Meta spent on the metaverse, to pour into artificially like making something appear more than it is. But by then, Facebook had rebranded to Meta. Mark and his legless avatars are telling us that this is going to change the world and change how we relate. And so I think that there was this both like ego-driven need for this to be successful, but then also like, this was the focus of the company. And if this wasn't going to be successful, well, what was going to happen to our stock price? What was going to happen to kind of our kind of market dominance? And when you have a group of people that believes like, wow, what I'm doing is, net good for the world, even if it's harming, hundreds of millions of people, it's wild what as humans we are capable of in terms of justifying those decisions.
This is so triggering because that's the exact same argument being made right now by like OpenAI versus Anthropic versus Grok versus Gemini. Like originally, they're all like, we can't have this arms race because this technology is too dangerous, and this is for the benefit of humanity. And now they're all just like, well, mine's gonna make videos that undress minors even better than yours. And it's like, just within a few years, we get to this. And even if they weren't competing with each other, then they would just strawman China and be like, well, we have to get ahead. It just these logic traps, I feel like, keep cropping up in tech where people just convince themselves of anything in the name of competition.
It's funny in the kind of way where you start laughing and finish crying.
Yeah, I mean, this has been like maybe the biggest through line of our show. It was a big starting inspiration. I've talked about David Graeber's phrase, spiritual violence, of like what it means to do a bullshit job. And, he talks about bullshit jobs as jobs that have no purpose, but it also is a reference to like jobs that have an insidious purpose. And like, you're a good person doing an insidious job. And so like, you went from working at Meta and being like, this is the greatest place, this is changing things. Facebook, when it was Facebook, was going to change the world. And there's a little bit of this like the Steve Jobs sort of reality distortion field where you're like in this culture. And then you did get into Horizon Worlds. And then it was like, they weren't really keeping secrets from you. They were just out there being like, yeah, we know there's a discrepancy between what we're saying and what we're doing. But I also think that like the reason that these apps get into these situations is because the culture of all tech companies, even tech companies that are not evil, but are doing things that benefit the business and punish the consumer in death by 1,000 paper cuts, twiddling style, right? Is that there's this culture of mutually understood spin where everybody knows that you are telling a narrative internally that is not the whole truth and is not maybe the reason you selected that feature, but everybody's in on that, but we don't talk about it. And we know we're not supposed to talk about it. And over time, what that does is like a lot of those little paper cuts are going to be innocuous, right? Where it's like, you set up a new feature that tracks your user more and you like tell yourself that it's going to personalize, right? It's a very common one. You're doing it to get the data and you're going to tell the user it's going to make better recommendations. And internally, you don't talk about that you're kind of being shady with the data, right? But then what that does is when you have thousands and thousands and thousands of that, when that's your whole day-to-day culture at work, it lowers your tolerance for being able to see the discrepancies when they are pointing to things that are not so innocuous and that are actually quite dangerous and can really threaten the safety and security of your consumers. But I think also like when people think about whistleblowers, they do often think that it's kind of like your situation where you're brought in and you're like, oh my God, everybody knows this is bad and we're doing it anyway. But the reason these companies can continue on and staff thousands of people in multinational corporations is because most people are in that reality distortion field. Most people know that you're massaging this narrative because that's what you do at work and you don't really think about it. You put in one of your documentation that Sheryl Sandberg had like literally said, our policies made us miss the chance to get kids on Facebook. And when I read that out here in this context, having never worked at Facebook, I'm like, that's a crazy thing to read. I can see that for what it is. But that is a normal thing to say inside a tech company. Like you wouldn't necessarily hear it, no matter how much integrity you have. Like they make the culture so that you don't necessarily hear that as a red flag, you know?
Well, in part, I think that my level of like full-chested indoctrination into the belief that Facebook was really good for the world made me a model employee in the sense that I would hear a quote, like let's say that I was, before all of this happened and I heard Sheryl Sandberg say that, I would think, yeah, there's probably a context by which kids should be on Facebook, right? But that's, requires also assuming that there are people in the company that are making sure that that can be done safely and in a way that's not going to cause a bunch of other issues for them, or especially not expose them to really horrific things like child predators, and that we would be also equally investing in that. And I think that level of naivety and trust ultimately in the company to make choices that were, I don't know, responsible tech leadership, based in responsible tech leadership, was part of why it was so shocking to me to walk into rooms where it was being discussed the way it was at Horizon. And I've thought a lot about, like, is this what all of these consumer-facing senior product leadership rooms have been like, and for how long, right? Where there's just an acknowledgement and an acceptance that the product is harmful, and that our job is to make it seem less harmful and to mitigate the risks of the company. I don't know. I wasn't there in those rooms, but my sense is that it probably was like that in a lot of those environments. And they brought in their kind of autistic baddie who had been willing to nod along and really believed in what they were saying for so long, but then that it was just shocking and totally incompatible with my view of the company. And so, I mean, when I started pushing back on it, I really thought that people are going to say, oh my God, like, of course. I mean, I can remember saying, like, we are still recovering from the trust that was lost in Cambridge Analytica. Like, we can't afford, even from a business standpoint, to be lying and obscuring the harms of this product. And it was just like a nothing burger, and that really surprised me. And yeah, led to like a kind of breakdown of my entire sense of self, because then I had to go back and rerun all of those tapes and all of those assumptions and realize, oh my God, like the justifications I've been using to stay not only working here, but like a passionate advocate and a loyalist to people like Mark and to the company, it was probably all based on some really kind of naive expectations of how the rest of the company was operating. And I think that there's a lot of people that, whether it's due to, neurodivergence, naivety, or I think in some cases just like a conscious or unconscious cognitive dissonance, by which, like, acknowledging that means that you also have to acknowledge that your paycheck comes from harm. I think that there's a lot of those mechanisms that exist kind of in different ways that allow companies like Meta to keep really, I think, good people working on really evil things.
There's also something uniquely American about it as well, because the other side of this is the regulation, the laws we pass, the culture we have that values innovation above almost even human life. Like you were just testifying with the Washington Senate, and you gave this really moving testimony about the damage that this is inflicting upon kids who have taken their own life after being fed this algorithmic garbage. And the first question you get is, well, if we passed legislation that would stop them from killing kids, would they still be able to be profitable?
Yeah.
And you just immediately were like, I reject the framing of your question. Like, this country seems like it would rather kill kids than kill a business.
Oh, I have goosebumps. I've said that too. I mean, I have a friend who's also a kind of whistleblower, and he got a message from another kind of former colleague of ours a few months ago that was like, you realize that this stuff you're advocating for is going to kill startups. And that's what I said to him. I was like, isn't it interesting he's more concerned about killing startups than killing kids? Like, how innovative are we actually if we can't do this without harming the most vulnerable?
Well, and what is even the point of regulation? That shouldn't the foundational thing be that if you can't turn a profit without harming literal children, then you shouldn't be a business? Like, isn't that why we don't allow child labor anymore.
And this is why Josh and I constantly on the show end up back at the line of like, what is the point of your money? What is the point of it? What is it for? What is it for? Why do you need this? Like,
yeah, that's the saddest part of this for me, is in the same way that while I believed that Meta was and Facebook was a force for good in the world, it was in part because the company had the opportunity to actually do that. Like, I can remember when Meta added, or it was Facebook at the time, kind of non-binary pronouns. And it's like, this matters. Like, at the scale we're operating, I mean, that is not the hallmark of innovation, but that's an example of how kind of the decisions made by really powerful companies can make a huge impact on culture and society and people's experiences of themselves. And yeah, it's like so fascinating to me that you have these companies. I mean, literally, as we're speaking, Meta is laying deep sea fiber like under the ocean, circumnavigating the entire globe. They are the company that flew drones over Africa. Like, all of these really quite complex, heavy lifts, innovative approaches to increase their power. And they, Mark wants to be known as the Julius Caesar innovative wonder boy. But when it comes to coming up with solutions that could actually allow you to run a business and a successful product without hurting vulnerable people, they throw their hands up in the air and they just try to piss off both sides of the political aisle and kind of stall and launch PR campaigns. And it's like, it doesn't have to be this way.
Absolutely. I do want to point out real quick too, just like going back to your experience at Meta. I don't think I've shared the story on the podcast, but my first product job I worked at for years. I loved it. I reported an org leader for sexual harassment, and then I was harassed so badly that I was forced to resign. And I was very young. It was my first real job. And I remember telling people that this was happening, but like, when I reflect back on it, I was so scared. And like, I've always been a badass. And like, the level of effectiveness, like how easy it was for them to make me scared of what? I don't know. Like, it wouldn't work now because I know the game. But companies are incentivized for your emotional alignment to fit their value proposition. And so I want to point out to people that like, there is a reason why a lot of you see, like, if you watch like the Doge boys interviews from Congress, and we're like, how are these fucking idiots in this position to begin with? Actually, the way that we incentivize businesses in this country very much incentivizes milquetoast, middle of the road, yes dudes into leadership positions.
Hey.
And part of that is because there's a reason that like all the list of people on your whistleblower doc are all women. Like, this is a big problem of just how we socialize people to notice things in their community. But I want to call out that like, companies are incentivized to make you feel terrible. And this isn't even just if you're whistleblowing. Like, if you're going to get laid off for whatever reason, it probably has nothing to do with you. It's actually quite hard, especially in California, to fire people. Like, they need a lot of documentation to like support their liability. And so what they'll do almost inevitably is they'll make you feel bad first. So first, they'll make you feel like you are not as good as you used to be, and you have a bad attitude, and you are not a good representation of the company. And we're going to put you on a performance improvement plan, and it's going to make you better. And all of this is actually your fault. And so when we let you go, you won't be surprised because we've been telling you the whole time this is your fault. And that's what they did to you. And that's what they do to anybody who doesn't fit their mold of what they would like to see in their value proposition. And so like, I implore anybody listening who's like, I don't understand why my job sucks all of a sudden, guarantee it has nothing to do with you. Guaranteed. Like, it absolutely is because these companies are incentivized to cut down tall tulips, to make people, conform to their will. And they will do that by taking low shots at your self-worth so that you don't fight back.
Yeah, I mean, in my situation, Meta performed, I mean, the entire kind of 8 months I was on medical leave before I lost my job and was laid off. They performed this like, oh, we can't wait to have you back, and here's the job that's going to come back. But it was after they had already destroyed me. And, I think part of that, I might have been covering their ass. I think part of that might have been not realizing the degree to which I was pissed about what had happened and the actions that I was going to take. But what you say is so true. I mean, I've got to acknowledge that there are definitely some really important voices in this that are men. I'm thinking of Brian Boland and Arturo Behar, both of whom testified in LA and in New Mexico. And I wouldn't have, gotten to the point where, and I ended up filing a federal lawsuit again, or it was a Washington state lawsuit. They moved it to federal court. Now it's a federal lawsuit against Meta. And I have Brian's kind of coaching in large part to thank for that, but they're outliers. Like, you are right that the culture is definitely one of, Mark Zuckerberg himself asked for more masculine workplaces while, he's well aware that his company is being eroded by misogyny, both inside and outside. And that's part of why I filed my lawsuit. It wasn't just about, yes, like the kids being harmed via these product decisions is a huge issue. It's where I spend most of my time now. But the lawsuit, the legal action was really about recognizing everything from like the more kind of expected, visible sexual harassment I experienced like early in my career with a boss saying, hey, you have to have sex with me to get promoted, or being told to act less smart, or, all of this stuff that I'd experienced over this long career there, that while I'm there, I'm kind of justifying as bad apples, bad, individuals that are making poor choices. By the time I got to the end and, I am on top, I have a ton of power, and still the disregard for women within the decision-making environments is now I'm seeing it get coded directly into the products that then go and are scaled to millions and millions of people. And it's like, no longer was it this, I was able finally to break through of kind of what you describe of this, oh gosh, like there's so much shame and, I don't want to rock the boat, and all of the kind of thinking that leads us to, I could have filed a lawsuit 12 years earlier, right? I didn't. But I did when I did, because I recognized, wow, this is all connected. It is this systemic disregard for women and other marginalized folks that leads to this harm directly.
This is what gets me really scared, is that Meta and similar companies are the ones building chatbots now, which have even more direct access to children. One of the chatbots you'd mentioned was like complimenting and sexualizing and praising minors as young as 8.
Based on the guidelines, which is effectively like the rules that go into training this chatbot, that were approved by legal, by comms, and by Meta's chief ethicist. It wasn't like a fluke. It wasn't like, oh, this chatbot went AWOL and talk to this kid the way it was designed to behave that way.
Right. So this is a softball, but what are the dangers of having companies like X, Meta, who have such a proven track record of harassment, discrimination, flaunting the law? What's the danger of having them hold this new, really powerful technology in their hands and be the ones shaping it?
It is like turning your kid onto Mark Zuckerberg to be their new best friend. These products are being positioned as, literally companions, like a solution to the loneliness epidemic that Mark Zuckerberg himself created. And when this is the sort of kind of moral threshold and strategic approach to how these products are designed, and they're meant to be pseudo relationships with people, and especially I'm thinking about kids. It's like it's wild to imagine. I just want people to picture them closing the door on their bedroom with Mr. kind of giant black t-shirt, gold chain, obnoxious glasses, manosphere, need more masculinity, building my bunkers and causing genocides. This is who they're befriending.
Horrifying.
Oh, and that's a good segue. I want to get in, like, zooming out a little bit. Obviously, the last couple of years, you've really devoted yourself to being an advocate for the harms of social media, particularly as they affect children. You've befriended a number of these families who have lost children to the harms of social media. And I'm curious, like, can you give us a little bit of stage setting for, like, why a 10-year-old is going to get on Horizon World? Like, I'll give you an example. Like, in the last episode, we talked about attention, and we were talking about people who think it's easy to just, like, not touch your phone. Like, it's like, well, if you're addicted to social media, that's your fault, right? And it's like, well, it's actually not. Like, they're intended to work that way. And so why is it unrealistic to assume that we just should parent our children better and they shouldn't get online? Like, what is the appeal and the pressure for them to be on these platforms?
You know, as you mentioned, that kind of compulsive use or addiction, I mean, I'm sure I've struggled with it. I mean, I'm sure that most adults have experienced that. And it's important to consider the science that until we're about 25, our prefrontal lobes are still developing. And that's effectively like the brakes on our speed cars. And then you also have products that are designed with casino based strategies. You know, you go to a casino and you don't see the windows, you don't see the clocks. Like, there's a reason that there's no end to the scroll. There's a reason that you're seeing kind of intermittent reinforcement in the quality and nature of the content you're receiving. So you have kids that are driving these sports cars without brakes. And can you imagine, like, having the opportunity to have kind of an endless feed of dopamine inducing content and being alone in your bedroom with that device? Like, of course, that's a vulnerability. And that science it's really clear. And one of the witnesses in the Los Angeles social media trial was Dr. Anna Lemke from Stanford University. And she talked a lot about addiction and specifically like how these products are designed to exploit kind of the very fundamental aspects of human nature that addiction does. And there's also a reason that for a lot of other addictive products or experiences that are proven to be harmful, cigarettes, drinking, gambling, right? Even though adults can still choose to opt in and can manage healthy limits in most cases, kids lack that capacity. And so we change their access. And while we sit with that context, we have tech companies that are prioritizing capturing kids. Kids have the highest long-term retention. The earlier they join, they have extremely high kind of long-term value for the companies, and that's why. It's really sad. It's exploiting those vulnerabilities to pad the pockets of billionaire dudes. So the back to stage setting, like some of the harms that come from that, like the science is really clear that there's kind of divergent brain development that happens based on the amount of time that is being spent in these experiences. Obviously, lost sleep, mood, anxiety, depression. And one of the pieces of evidence in the LA case, there's a internal document. It was an email where a Meta employee said, like, our goal state is that kids are sneaking views of their phone under their desk at chemistry class. Like, it's really exploitative. But then the kind of other side of that coin is that with that dependency comes a lot of other vulnerabilities. If you're, heavily dependent and influenced by your social feed, and like the example I talked about in the Washington State testimony you mentioned, this young man named Mason Edens, he went to his device in the wake of a breakup. He's searching for positive affirmations and gets served a steady stream of pro-suicide content until he took his life. And you have tech companies that are like, whoa, like, we didn't upload that. Yeah, but you know that your product drives influence. So you can convince people to buy toothpaste and change their mind about everything else. And you know that showing a sad kid content like this is going to keep him there longer. You might not have uploaded that, but you made sure he saw it. You made sure he saw a lot of it. That's a problem. And then you get into New Mexico is all about the predators that find kids on these platforms, in part because there's a huge amount of time that's where kids are. That's where they're spending 7-8 hours a day. And there's that sort of emotional vulnerability of the level of kind of trust with these products, and they feel safe opening up and talking to people without maybe understanding who they are. And then suddenly they're kind of deep into grooming. You have sexploitation, right? Like so many especially young men, young straight men mostly are the victims of this because they have someone usually from like a data farm in another country reaching out to them, pretending to be a teenage girl, saying, here's a naked picture of me, send one back. And when they do, they're told, oh, actually, you owe me, $2,000. And if you don't, I am going to share this with everyone you know. And they can find everyone they know because Instagram's features are such that it's not private. It's not protected by default to see who kids' friends are. These are all like design choices that are not necessary to run a successful business and are really directly harmful to kids.
Not to out myself as the only person on this call who was born after 1993. But when Facebook launched in 2006, right, you needed to be at least 13 to have an account. Well, I remember my friends as young as like 8 years old making Facebook accounts. It was really easy to do. And immediately, like there was this FOMO and it became this huge, obviously I'm Gen Z and not Gen Alpha, but I imagine similar dynamics of like, if one person has it, no one cares. But if half your grade has it, then it's debilitating to not have it.
And also, we can optimize for that. So there's a number, it's a viral coefficient, and all these companies have an entire data team that can calculate the network effect and how you're doing, because that is essentially the way to grow these flywheels, right? When you talk about engagement loops, the goal is eventually that you don't have to market because the customers are doing your marketing for you. And like Cory Doctorow talks about that as being part of switching costs, where it's completely reasonable for a person, like Josh knows this, I'm really into Threads. I have never had an emotional relationship with a social media platform before. I was not a LiveJournal girly, I wasn't a Tumblr girly, and all of a sudden at the big age of mid-30s, I'm obsessed with Threads. And it's a meta product, and I feel very like conflicted about it, right? It's in its golden era at the beginning of the enshittification curve where like Meta is not paying much attention to it, and it's just a bunch of like millennial aunties on there in a big group chat. But like the network effects are part of the switching costs. So like the reason I would not want to get off of Threads is because that is where all my like online friends are now. And that's where my content is. And I've curated it and I've saved information. And all of those are pieces of an extremely well-studied, well-architected engagement loop that people like me are taught how to implement. And so like, that's not by accident. It's not because it's just a great product, right? Like these are all very intentional architectural decisions that are made so that it becomes too big to leave, essentially.
So this is the most horrifying part of working on this podcast, which is that I don't have a technical background. And every time I'm like, man, isn't it crazy how companies do XYZ? Ariel's like, oh yeah, no, we optimize for, making people want to die. And so I guess my question is like, if this is such an open secret, like how does Meta keep avoiding accountability here? I guess maybe now they're finally going to be facing accountability, but like, walk us through like lobbying, intimidation, like how do they get out of all of these situations?
Yeah, I mean, Meta is so highly skilled at performing care and at the kind of propaganda and the spin and everything Ariel is describing earlier about the like how do we justify product decisions. In hindsight, like I can see how that was done in so many different ways and then continues to be done today. You asked about like lobbying and bribes, and I'll talk about that, but I also want to talk about like how that works inside the company too, because I was working there when Frances Haugen leaked her trove of documents that became the Facebook files that was covered in the journal. And it's so embarrassing to admit that like I was a director of the company. I didn't even read the article because Facebook got ahead of it. We got emails and we were shown screenshots of some of the leaked documents that were really kind of very intentionally selected to be the screenshots of the many, many, many documents that were from, conversations in internal workplace, which is like internal Facebook, where people are saying kind of crazy things, but they're like, it's a junior employee that works in a totally different product that knows nothing about the product. And so then it's explained to us, like, of course we care about kids' safety. Here, look how out of context this is being taken. And in isolation, like I looked at that and thought, oh my gosh, like what a grifter. And, now I look at her as a hero, right? Because I actually have the full context, but they were just really selectively choosing what they were saying true things, but omitting really, really important pieces of information that obscured the whole picture. And that's the same strategy that I see them do over and over inside and outside the company. So I've seen different numbers, but definitely in the high tens of millions of dollars spent lobbying against legislation that would require them to have a duty of care to the people that they serve and not build products that harm them, right? And they do that by having completely kind of different approaches to the subject with regulators and politicians on both sides of the aisle. So they might go to a Republican and talk about censorship, and this is an issue of needing to protect the Constitution, and we don't want left-wing bias in our media. And then the same lobbyists will go to a Democrat and say, this law would harm gay kids. And they'll load up a bus full of gay kids and send them to DC when the truth, right, might be somewhere in the middle. And the solutions are accessible, right? There's ways to make sure we regulate without censorship and without harming marginalized groups, but they're just extremely skilled at presenting a version of it to someone that they know is really vulnerable to be incensed by that. I mean, it's funny enough, it's the same issue with the disinformation and polarization in our news feeds as consumers, right? We are programmed to get mad, to get sad, to react, to have these strong emotional reactions that drive perception shifts. And that's what happens when we're on Facebook. It's what they're doing broadly. We got really close to passing KOSA, the Kids Online Safety Act, a couple of years ago. And I mean, that's again a pretty complex topic. It initially, KOSA would have been really bad for LGBTQ plus kids. A lot of changes were made. I think in the middle, it was potentially a really good legislation that could have saved a lot of kids. Mike Johnson was about to pass that through. Meta showed up investing. I think it was in the mid tens of billions of dollars in a data center in his home state, and suddenly he backed off from sponsorship. So that's another tactic. And then the other thing to consider with our policymakers is that Sarah Wynne Williams talks about this in Careless People. I mean, she was in the room when it was being discussed, but if we are the goose that lays the golden egg, they're not going to want to get rid of the goose. Meaning, if Facebook is the way with which these politicians are getting elected, well, they're not going to want to go up against us. And I think it's, I've come to learn through people like Sarah and through this pattern of behavior that I think that's been a pretty effective strategy for them, which, not to jump around too much, but when you think about the significance of the news we covered at the beginning of this episode, those jurors, they don't have data centers in their backyards, right? They don't need to get elected. They are only accountable to the truth. And I think that's why it's so different, right? I loved the quote about Europe regulating and US litigating. But if that's the path by which we get to the truth, because our political systems have been so corrupted by companies like Meta, then I think that I'm glad that we can. I'm glad that we have that door open.
I never would have predicted that the fucking courts are the system that's giving me the most hope under Trump 2.0.
So thinking about what's next, one of the things I think is interesting about the juries deciding the way that they did is that I think there was a period of time, to your point, where that wouldn't have been possible because the average consumer still considered Facebook to be a darling of their life, right? That they were still holding on to it. I wonder if it were TikTok, TikTok was in the suit, but they settled out of court. TikTok and Snap both settled out of court. I don't know. Would TikTok have the same experience? People are pretty into it right now, even though it's had its own shaky last year. I'm curious, when we talk about regulation for social media, I think it's very hard for people to imagine what that would look like in a way that is sensible and still allows the joys of social media to exist. And I'll tell you, right even before this, Josh and I were on the phone and we were disagreeing about what we would like to see in social media regulation. And so I'm curious, What's your stance? What do you think like are the top priorities for what good regulation would look like in a way that tries to protect the elements of social media that really are still changing people's lives and are supporting small creators and are allowing people to find community and are helping people in safety? I mean, again, one of the reasons Threads is in its glowing era is that there's a lot of just like somebody asks for help or advice and they get it. And like that's what it's for. That's what social media is for. So like, what does it look like to you to have good regulation? How do you think that differs from what we are talking about? And like, have you seen it done well in another country?
Yeah, well, my perspective on this has evolved for sure. So if people look me up on Substack, I mean, you will find posts that look like pass COSA and repeal Section 230. And I don't feel that way about either of those things right now. I think that it's a complex answer, and I'm going to start with where we just ended, which is the courts, in that the product liability law is actually a higher burden, a higher standard than a duty of care even. And so if we, live in a world where companies are held accountable for the products they build, as they are in basically every other industry, that is important and enough, in my opinion, as far as like I am letting off the gas on the idea that we must pass duty of care legislation, in part because of what I just said, and also because of the ways that our previous topic, the meta lobbyists, have quite effectively bastardized that legislation. So the current version that's in the House is so problematic. It includes language preemption clauses around state AI legislation and state social media legislation. So any states that have passed guardrails and guidelines about either of those things, that would go away. But it also includes language now that would close the courtroom doors to families, school districts, all these folks who have cases lined up. And it is no longer the Kids Online Safety Act. It is the big tech get out of jail free card. So that's one piece of it. The other that you hear talked about a lot is Section 230, which came into existence in 1996 as a law as part of the Communications Decency Act. And it was created with the intention of actually encouraging moderation by not holding tech companies accountable for either what they did or didn't moderate, in the sense that they aren't accountable for third parties' content on their site. And this is in the time of like AOL and message boards and MySpace. And it made a lot of sense then. They're trying to extend the principles that newsstands, for instance, the liability law of a newsstand, where you're not going to be held accountable for a piece of disinformation that's in a magazine that you stock in your newsstand, and extend that to the internet in a way that makes it such that people aren't afraid to host third-party content or engage with it, right? When Meta shut off I was part of the team that pushed the button that shut off Trump's ability to publish through the API after the insurrection. And that was protected by Section 230. We wouldn't have podcasting without Section 230. No one would host it. I wouldn't have a Substack. We wouldn't have Yelp. We wouldn't have LinkedIn. So that's all true. And it's also true that until this week, companies like Meta have stood behind it by saying, we aren't responsible for the content on our site. We aren't responsible for the actions of third parties on our site. And that is a big problem. It is a big problem that they've hid behind that, when the issue isn't necessarily, as I've talked about today, like the content. It's about the predatory design and some of the product decisions. And so I do believe that it would be great for Section 230 to kind of come into the modern internet age, where we can take that kind of newsstand analogy and think about, okay, well, like, what if I walk into a newsstand and the shop owner knows that in the back corner there's a bunch of predators and they're not telling me that my kid shouldn't go back there? Or what if I walk into the newsstand and the shop owner is showing me every 10 seconds a magazine that turns out to be full of lies about important world news? Like, that context is totally different. And we do need, I believe, legislation that considers a world where many internet sites run on algorithmic recommendation engines, both in terms of the content and the people. But I no longer believe that Section 230 needs to go away. I think that would be a really bad thing for the internet.
But would they be profitable?
Oh my gosh. Josh. But I've thought a lot about, in the UK right now, they're exploring specifically around disinformation and misinformation and algorithms, like what should we do from a legislative standpoint? And that's a really interesting one for me. I think the laws I get excited about, the suggestions I get excited about, are principles-based approaches to things like transparency, for instance, like giving academics and governments access to see what are recommendation engines based on, by giving people, especially kids, the ability to reset their algorithm or to choose a chronological feed. Like, I think those kind of consumer protections are important and will raise the burden on tech companies to actually build products that create a ton of value, such that you aren't going to want to turn that off, or that you can find a lot of value in the product even without casino-like mechanisms.
So again, as the guy who knows the least about technology on this episode, would there be a way with 230 to retain our ability to have free speech on the internet, right? If you have a message board, I can come on the message board and say something crazy, and Kelly Stonelake is not held responsible for the comments of Josh Stratton Carlson, right? Is there a way to retain that while also tackling the algorithmic component and saying, again, like if you walk into a newsstand and the owner just charges you with child pornography on the newspaper, like that feels like a different world than just walking in and being like, which magazine am I going to buy, right? Is there a way of tackling that through legislation?
I believe so. I think we just need laws to be written that kind of consider those exceptions to free speech, like when there is that algorithmic amplification, when there are recommendation engines for the people you connect with, and when you are talking about like kids. I think that's the rules should probably be a little bit different, not in terms of free speech, but in terms of the standard that third parties are held to in terms of the content that they're suggesting to kind of our most vulnerable. I'm not a policy maker. I'm not a law writer, but I really believe that my understanding is that is possible, and I would really like to see that happen. But it's such a polarized topic. You just have people that are either you got to get rid of it completely or how dare you. And there's a podcast I've been loving lately called Otherwise Objectionable, which is, I think, the last two words of the kind of 26 words in Section 230 that are the most debated. What I appreciate is that the host, Mike Masnick, both hates big tech and wants to see big tech change, and lays out such a clear and compelling argument for why it would be so bad for Section 230 to go away. And these are the kind of people that I want to see influencing the legislation of tomorrow.
It's interesting because something we were chatting about in our pre-screen is that both Ariel and I are queer, and we were talking about this kind of, the mythical gay kid in Kansas or whatever. And I myself have used that as a defense of, while I'm very critical of social media, it's like, well, if you're part of, insert X group with few people in that community, it's really nice to connect. You actually have a whole microsite that talks about this in depth with queer kids online. And I thought something that was interesting is you talked about how there are recognizable benefits to like self-identity, confidence, solidarity that trans, non-binary, and queer youth get from being online. But they also have uniquely high levels of mental health harms and online discrimination. Maybe this is one of those cases where you could talk about getting rid of the algorithmic component, which is what is feeding these kids such toxic material while still allowing them to engage with one another. Is that kind of the way you're thinking about this, or is there a different approach?
Yeah, I mean, I've paid close attention to Australia's social media ban, or they call it a forced delay. Many other countries following suit. I saw today Indonesia doing the same. And generally, like in absence of better solutions, I think that is a better move to take than doing nothing. Australia made that decision, and then the next week there were probably hundreds of thousands of kids that did not see footage of people being massacred on Bondi Beach because of that decision, right? And as you said, like marginalized kids, benefit disproportionately from online community and also are more likely to be targeted and harassed and experience negative impacts based on, from social media. There's one argument to be made that there are plenty of other communities like the Trevor Project or kind of other places that kids could go that's not social media for that community. And I think that is, to a degree, comforting in contexts like Australia's social media ban, in the sense that these kids aren't completely cut off from the internet or community. But I don't think it's the ideal solution. Earlier this year, I worked on legislation here at Washington State that I think is a really good middle-of-the-road approach. It would limit minors' access to algorithmic feeds if they opt out. All right. And I think parents with parental permission can opt back in, which means that anything that they sign up to follow, right, that they say, I want to be in this group, I want to follow updates from this creator, they're still going to see all of that. This piece of legislation also limited tech companies' ability to provide notifications to kids while they're at school, like during school hours or overnight. I think that that's pretty reasonable. It doesn't mean they can't open up their app. It just means that they're not going to be hearing the pinging sound all night. And that legislation actually died. And it died because the tech lobby got to the Democrats about queer kids. And the final weekend where it didn't make it to the floor to vote, I was, on an email thread with every Democratic member of Congress in Washington and explaining, like, here's where this issue's been misrepresented. And that's why I built that microsite, right? Because I realized, oh my gosh, it's really unclear. And it's both, like, kind of what I talked about earlier. You get one side of the aisle thinks, oh my gosh, it would be really bad if gay kids didn't have access to the internet. On the other side of the aisle, you hear, oh gosh, gay kids are being really harmed from the internet. We need to help them. And the truth is both. And there's a path forward where you can kind of hold multiple truths at once and come up with solutions that protect our liberties to the maximum degree possible, while also respecting the science and the kind of reality of how this plays out in everyday lives for normal people.
This is a really good example of where money in politics and lobbying from anybody robs us of democracy. Because, like, we are three educated people on this topic, invested in continuing to be able to use social media for the purposes that we want to use it for. I found out I was asexual from a social media post in my 20s. Like, these things really do have impact. I'm doing a lot of, like, leftist resistance. I literally cannot get that information except on social media. It will not come anywhere else. It has to be on social media. And, like, we should have this interesting conversation. Like, I was telling Josh, we're working on potentially doing a porn episode about, like, how porn platforms work and how sex workers are penalized on mainstream platforms and all that. And from that lens, I was like, don't repeal Section 230 and never age gate a website. And then I realized when I was working on this episode, I was like, wait, in my head, I've been like, yeah, we should age gate social media. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Why would I feel, some discrepancy in this? And that's because it's an interesting policy conversation. This is what democracy is supposed to be like, is we're supposed to pull out a whiteboard and work together and be like, what do we want to see in this legislation? And big tech shouldn't have a say in it at all. I think about this with AI as well. Like, this is the same conversation with AI of, like, there's a lot of really interesting conversations to be had here that we can't have because the people who are running the conversations and making the narrative are the people who benefit from us being concussed while using AI, and like, it sucks that, like, we can't actually have these interesting policy conversations because we can't even get anywhere in the way that our court system currently works,
Well, and what's so interesting to me about that example is, like, the science behind the way social media harms kids as it's currently designed and operates. I can just imagine the stack of papers on my desk, and it would be 20 times higher than the stack of how porn could harm a kid. Like,
exactly.
I would give, exactly. If Meta and YouTube, if they don't make any changes to how their products work, my kids would have access to porn way before they would have access to social media. It is so much more harmful. And that's one thing that is just wildly crazy to me about the effectiveness of these lobbying dollars is that that's not how we're looking at it. It's just this like, oh my God, protect the kids from porn. And it's like, what? Like,
Yeah.
I would like a solution where we don't have to age gate anything, but Meta knows that they're harming your kid. They know when they're at school, they know what school they go to, and they could be making changes to make it safer for them. They're not. Why is it that in certain states, I can't log into Pornhub without showing my ID, right? It's just really confusing.
Well, Twitter also hosts porn, so surely they wouldn't benefit from a massive campaign to block traffic from Pornhub and instead force people to spend more time on Twitter. Sorry, guys. Yeah, I had something there.
Well, and for the companies that don't allow porn, now they've got AI chatbots you can make your own.
Yeah, my big thing that I would love to see is I think optimizing for watch time should be illegal. I think that all algorithms that use watch time as a variable should be illegal. Like if we know what damage addictive screen use from any platform causes, they shouldn't be allowed to optimize for watch time. I mean, Laura Bates' first book is all about how YouTube optimizing for watch time is like pretty directly related to the rise of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, to wrap us up, Kelly, we so appreciate you being here and sharing this with us. I mean, literally, I've been following your work for so long that like I feel very lucky to be able to have you explain it to us. And then this week of all weeks, how did we luck out, you know?
Oh my gosh, I feel so lucky. I'm so grateful to be familiar with your work here. I have listened to several episodes and love it and will be a regular listener moving forward. So it's a total honor.
Yay.
I'm so grateful that something like this exists where these topics are discussed with this level of kind of thoughtfulness and nuance and openness that is required to actually solve some of these issues.
Before we go Falcon mode, where would you like the people to find you on the internet? What are you doing next? What do you want people to know?
Sure. Well, my Instagram, just kidding. Not on that anymore.
That was good.
I got off Meta Properties when I filed my lawsuit, as you could imagine, because I just don't trust them. But that has been sad. That has been personally hard for me. But it's also been good. I am on Substack. My newsletter is called Overturned by Kelly Stonelake, and that is the best place to follow me. I feel really supported by even a free subscription. All of my content is not subscription gated, but those subscribers really put wins in my sales. And then I'm also on LinkedIn. That's the kind of, it's funny, Natalie was talking about it too, but that's kind of the one place where I've stayed kind of engaged in socials. And I do love the folks that kind of don't want you talking about the uncomfortable topics on there without recognizing that for some people this is their job. So and it affects all of our jobs, and many of our employers are advertisers in these environments. So I'm going to keep kind of piping off on there and sharing my perspective. So that's where I can be found.
Okay, awesome. Well, should we go Falcon mode?
Let's do it.
All right, Kelly, you've listened. You know what's coming. Hit us with your best Falcon sound.
I pulled up some reference. I was like, I don't want to just infer. I want to know what they actually sound like.
Incredible.
So here, let's try it.
Yes!
That's the best one we've ever gotten, honestly. It's so
Yeah,
good.
the sound, I really was, without my research, I would have thought it was more of like a caca, but it's like a scream.
Yeah,
Let's
that's so
go.
funny.
Let's go.
Crying.
So Falcon Mode is our listener submitted segment where we take a listener submitted idea or a problem and we chat about how to make it more usable, feasible, and fundable. So today, listener Daniel writes, I recently lost my middle management job and I'm looking at picking up Instacart or DoorDash shifts to fill in the gap. I wish there was a website where I could offer details about my life, what kind of car I have, or when I can pick up shifts, and it'll tell me which of the gig apps are best in my area for my needs.
Thank you, Daniel. Sorry about your job loss. We've all been there. I looked this up. This is an idea people have had. I would not say any of the current executions are what I would have designed, but I will give a couple platforms that do exist and then how I would do it if we were going to build it as like an actually useful product. So I tried to constrain here, I'm sort of assuming because Instacart and DoorDash were mentioned. There are obviously different types of gig work. I mean, I attest and will defend that being a tech worker is now also gig work. If your average tenure in a job is 18 months, that is gig work, babe. But I will say for this, I'm restraining it to what I would call like low barrier to entry, like plug and play gig work, where you don't need a specialized portfolio or special certifications. So that takes out like TaskRabbit or like Fiverr or Upwork or things where you're doing remote work that's like within a very specific skill set. And these are more, I need to be able to pick up a shift tomorrow and get some wages in. So that would be grocery and food delivery, like Instacart, Uber Eats, or DoorDash, rideshare, Uber and Lyft, package or supply delivery. So that could be Amazon Flex, scooter return, which I don't even know if that's a thing anymore, but it used to be you get $5 to return and charge some of these scooters. And then also like there's some data entry and annotation, a job we have poured endless shit onto, but like you can technically sign up to do work on Amazon Mechanical Turk. So the way I would do this is I would say that somebody puts in their like requirements for what they'd like their job to be. So shifts available, whether it has to be remote or not, whether they have a car they can use or not, and then physical requirements like can you lift, how far can you walk, stuff like that. I do think there should be like a market. The first thing would be like a market saturation map. I know in Los Angeles, it's actually quite difficult to get a job with Instacart or DoorDash. There are so many people who are doing layered gig work that like the wait list for those is oftentimes many months. So it'd be helpful to be able to see like in your area, where is the biggest opportunity to be able to get a shift tomorrow. So like length of wait list to sign up. I would also like to see like the stuff that actually helps workers. So on top of like how much are you going to make on average and how many, like, you know, how much work is there available for you? I would like to see a rating of the company's level of algorithmic wage theft. I would like to see their level of like liability if something were to happen to you on the job. In contract work, you're almost never covered by any type of protections from the platform. So like if you do offer protections, that would be a point up. And then similar like rate of harassment or safety concerns. I'm sure we've all seen the Uber stat that every 8 minutes somebody in an Uber is sexually assaulted, which obviously I think is usually referring to passengers, but it's dangerous to be a worker out there as well. So that's how I would build it. I don't know how you'd get that information. It would have to be crowdsourced, but luckily there are so many people who do gig work that it should not be that difficult to crowdsource. In terms of platforms that already exist that kind of do this, I will say that the market sort of sensibly, nobody is doing the level of like, how's the algorithmic wage theft? You know, what's the rate of harassment? Like nobody's really doing that. I think that these companies are kind of bought into some of these extra platforms where you like optimize your shift work or whatever. So they obviously wouldn't want that. There are some tools for like, what's the market saturation and like which app is best to get on tomorrow. The one that seems like it's the best is called Gridwise. It's the most built out. I will say that it is like more about managing all of the documentation that you need as a gig worker, particularly if you use more than one of these apps. So it's managing your mileage, it's managing your tax feature so that like when you go to do reporting of how much you've spent that could be tax deductible, it's all in one place. It does also have a feature of like the market saturation to let you know. That's the best option in my opinion, but the fact that any of these platforms cost money makes me personally outraged because it just feels so deeply exploitative. There's another app called Solo that's $96 a year. It has mileage tracking features and tax features. It is not particularly helpful for the like what's actually the best option for me. It's just like optimizing once you get into it. And I've never done this before. I'm going to talk shit about a product as well. I've never done that in Falcon mode. There is an app and it's not personal. I'm sorry, guy who made ShiftMate, but there is a new product that launched at the end of last year called ShiftMate. And I'm just going to say, this is a really good example of a red flag website. I would never use this product. I don't think anybody should use this product. Some red flags that I have, their product screenshots are not straight from the product. Very obviously, those are mock-ups that were made. They're selling merch for a brand nobody knows for a product that just launched in like October. And it costs $250 a year, which is like twice the rate of what the other apps cost for literally like fewer features. I think its main, like this is a classic scenario where like the guy who made it is like, I also used to do gig work and now I've leveled up to teach you how to do gig work. So like clear grift hustle, would not go down that path. So I would also just say, I think this is like, I was getting enraged just doing research for this because it's such an exploitative space. this already, that like any additional apps that are cannibalizing your already paltry wages from these stupid fucking apps like makes me angry. But
Shiftmate also sounds like an AI companion bot.
Yeah, yes,
for poly pansexuals. Come on, guys.
Shiftmate.
It's constantly shifting. It's whatever you want.
Or shifters, like for people who have like an Omegaverse fantasy or whatever.
God. We're not. First mention of the Omegaverse on Actually Useful. I'm quitting the pod.
This long, actually.
I'm quitting the pod.
I love this Falcon mode suggestion or question because it's a really good idea in terms of being able to create actual value for gig workers. Like I could see, I've in my own experience, like being kind of partially incapacitated and like, wow, I'd love to do some gig work. I have no idea what is going to kind of further traumatize me and what is going to be easiest and what is going to be more expensive than earning. You know, you read kind of these horror stories, and it's this conversation makes me want like the glass door of gig work,
Totally.
like a place where you can aggregate people's experiences instead of kind of aggregating your own Discord and Reddit, kind of like doing your own piecemeal research, where you can aggregate people's experiences with different gig opportunities. And then it seems like with that data, you could create a really helpful tool to figure out what the right opportunity is for you. And it seems like you could probably provide a lot of value while charging then the companies like the Instacarts and the Ubers, ask them like, where are your lowest saturated markets? And we can help connect you with gig workers there and charge them and provide a free service to gig workers where they can get actual kind of information. And it becomes this really interesting accountability mechanism for the companies.
Every once in a while we get a Falcon mode where we're like, should we build it? Should we do it? Can we make that?
I know, I was
and
just sitting here like, that's a good
They're
idea.
tinkering all these algorithms against us to see how much they can squeeze out. It's time to fight back.
Yeah, fight back. Well, and also I think this is interesting because I can almost guarantee that your experience being like, let's just say a DoorDash driver is going to be really different in Los Angeles than it is going to be in like Milwaukee or whatever. Like both because the laws are different in different states have like wildly different labor laws that affect contractors, and also just like the types of buildings you're going into, the types of traffic you're going, like all the things that are variables and how you do that job are so specific to the location.
How long is a typical trip? What are examples of a typical store? I also want to know things like, what autonomy do I have to opt out of requests that I don't want to do? How am I penalized for doing that within the kind of companies, the app structure? My brain is churning on this. It's probably, I got warmed up with my Falcon call though.
Yeah, that's why we do it. That's why we do it. Gets the bloods pumping. All right. Well, Kelly, it has been such a blast talking to you, even though it was a depressing topic. But we are so glad that you are pushing back in the way you are. And obviously, it's been a great week for consumer protections against Meta. So we really appreciate it. And listeners, if you want to send us a Falcon mode or thoughts on the show, you can email us at heyactuallyuseful@gmail.com or hit us up on all the very bad social media applications at actuallyusefulpod. And otherwise, we will talk to you guys in a couple weeks. Bye.
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 Actually Useful is part of the Industry Plant Podcast Network. It's co-hosted and created by Ariel Butters and co-hosted, produced, and edited by Josh Stretton Carlson. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to our Substack or YouTube, or give us a follow on most social media platforms at Actually Useful Pod.